Thank you to everyone for joining us this afternoon. It's great to see a really large number of people here. I will be keeping an eye on the questions as we go through the webinar this afternoon, and I'll pose them to Kris and Anne as we're going, or hold it over for a Q&A session towards the end. To get started, I think seeing that we've got 145 participants at the moment, I think it would be really great to, if you can type into the comments section where you're joining us from, so what organisation and where you're based. That would be really interesting for us to see. And when you are adding a comment, just look at the little option bar above it and make sure you're sending it to all panellists and attendees. Otherwise, not everyone will be able to see it. So we've got people from Victoria, which is great. So many. Indocaribbean, you can see it. We've got Newcastle. So many, and a huge number of community service organisations across the country, which is fantastic to see. So while you're typing that in, I can see Kris and Anne are keeping an eye on that as it's coming through. It's amazing to see. And we're really happy that you could join us today. One of the things that we found, so the Red Cross Recovery Program in New South Wales, we have 8 recovery officers who are based in various locations throughout the state. And through their conversations with their colleagues in other organisations, we're finding that there are a number of community service organisations who had never found themselves working in communities that were recovering from disasters, particularly of the scale that we are seeing throughout Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia at the moment. And as a result, we wanted to work with Kris and Anne to reach out to those community service organisations and provide a perspective from organisations that have worked in supporting communities as they recover post-bushfire, and for them to share their experience of those fires, but also the fires from the 2019-2020 bushfire season, and provide an opportunity for you to ask questions and access that knowledge base that they have. So I'll pass over to Anne, who's going to start us off, and keep sending through questions, and I'll keep an eye on them as we go. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jess. Hi, everybody. Probably like Kris, I was scanning through all of the names and the places where everybody is from, and so welcome everybody. I feel really honoured and privileged to meet you all, even if it is in the virtual space. But, you know, I guess that's the upside of technology. You know, we're able to sort of connect across the entire country, let alone, you know, whatever state you're living in. So that's really amazing. And it also says to me that there's obviously a heck of a lot of interest out there in the role of community organisations in disaster recovery, but also preparing community for disaster. And I think this last bushfire season, or Black Summer as it's been come to, as it's now known, I think it's just been a watershed moment in so many ways, I think, and it's really probably upping the ante in so many ways in regards to thinking, you know, every part of the community needs to be involved in not just processes of recovery, but preparing for the next events that inevitably are going to be coming our way, unfortunately. So what I'm going to do is, I do have a little bit of a PowerPoint, and fortunately for me, I can't hear all the collective groans that might be happening at the moment. However, I promise you it is short and sweet. And I guess after that sort of formal part of what I'm going to be having a chat with you about, there's going to be plenty of opportunity for a little, you know, a bit more informal kind of sharing of ideas. So just bear with me for now. I'm not fantastic at Zoom, so fortunately I have the wonderful Jamie and Jess to help me if I stuff things up. So I'm going to go to share screen now and go to PowerPoint, she says optimistically. And hopefully you'll all be able to see this. Okay. So I hope everybody can see that. I know Jess or Jamie will tell me if, or you let Jess and Jamie know if you can't see this. But look, how I conceptualize recovery and preparedness, I call it barefoot. And, you know, apologies to Scott Pate, for those of you who know him, he's a kind of financial whiz kid, and some of you might have already bought his books, you know, The Barefoot Investor, I think it's called. But I think I've sort of borrowed that term to talk about recovery and preparedness because I know from an organisational point of view, and I'll give you a little bit of background about where I'm from, but from an organisational point of view, sometimes the thought of recovery, let alone the doing of recovery, and also disaster preparedness can feel you know, too complicated, too overwhelming. We're too busy to engage in it. And all of those are really valid kind of rationales and reasons for, you know, why we mightn't get around to thinking about it. We're just so busy keeping our services going, and we're just so busy, you know, meeting, you know, the increasing demand and need from vulnerable community. So the way that I see it, it needs to be simplified. Just taking first steps is, you know, is good enough, if that makes sense. But as I go through the presentation, hopefully this will make a little bit more sense. So I've called it barefoot recovery and barefoot preparedness, because sometimes I think when the environment becomes increasingly complex, we need to find ways to simplify processes and systems. So I'm just going to move on through. Okay, so some of you, I'm guessing, are already in the process of supporting your community through the impacts of, you know, Black Summer. And I know for some of you, you're probably real veterans in working in this space. You might have been working with community who's also been living with the impacts of drought. And then the bushfires have come through, and in some regions then followed by flood or heavy rain. And now we have the overlay of COVID-19. So we are really actively living and working in a very complex emergency environment. And so with that complexity can bring, you know, lots of impacts and flow-on effects, both at the organisational level and at the community level. So just very quickly, as you would all know, you know, the impacts of natural disasters are experienced at both at the level of the individual and the household, and at the community level. So if we think about community in an ecological framework, then all parts of that ecology are impacted, and all of those impacts intersect in one way or another. So essentially, as you would all be familiar with, that, you know, all aspects of normal day-to-day life have been disrupted. And if there wasn't disruption enough with the drought, for example, then the fires coming through, and now COVID-19. And obviously the Treasurer made his announcement yesterday that Australia is now officially in recession. So there are all of these flow-ons, and we are having to get used to working in the new normal, which is working with a level of complexity and significant disruption. The other thing, I'll just give you a little bit of background of my experience in a minute as well, so I can kind of contextualise my experience in working in disaster recovery. Part of my experience has taught me quite a lot, as it does naturally, but I've seen disaster events as potentially transformative, and those transformations can be both positive and negative, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about that in a minute. Obviously, recovery is an ongoing process, so the way that you know, it is, you know, commonly conceptualized now is that it's not a beginning or an end process. So there's no, there's obviously a beginning, but there isn't a defined end, if that makes sense. And certainly not what I've heard, and that's not what I have heard from the residents that Step by Step have connected with, both back in 2013 and currently. And it seems to be an ongoing process of continual adaptation. And that in itself can be extremely stressful. So what it actually involves is sort of continuing change, but with no guidebook. So, and I would also say that all disaster events involve loss and grief. And I guess part of the recovery process, what runs parallel with that is a grieving process, both at the individual level and at the collective community level. And as you would all be aware of, that there are many individuals and communities that, you know, for want of a better word, have been traumatized by these events. So before I go on, I'll just give you a little bit of background context, but I'll keep it short and sweet because Jamie did, you know, such a good job of introducing me and who I am. But essentially before 2013 and the catastrophic bushfires in the Blue Mountains, where, you know, 300 properties were either destroyed or damaged. And, you know, I don't know, I've lost count of how many hectares of bushland were lost, but it was catastrophic. I was working in Gateway Family Services, and Gateway is a place-based community organisation, medium-sized, not huge, but essentially working with, focused on working with vulnerable families and, you know, providing all the sorts of things that many of you would be providing, you know, crisis support, ongoing support, child protection services, and I guess a lot of you now are probably also offering disability support through NDIS. However, when the fires came through, we were tapped on the shoulder by the then Ministry for Police and Emergency Services, who said, look, we want to try something different. We would like to pull together a bunch of workers from the local community and welfare sector, pull them together into a team to provide more intensive personalised case management support to people who've been impacted by these bushfires. So before we came into this, we were completely disaster recovery novices. I know I certainly was. So I seconded from my position as the clinical practice manager to pull together this team and manage the team. So to say it was a steep learning curve is probably the understatement of the year. We learnt so much along the way. It was challenging, and I'm sure all of you would relate to this. It's a really challenging environment to be working in because it's certainly not static. It's a very fluid and ever-changing environment. So we learnt a lot from that experience. And then obviously we, go away little sign. So this time around we were tapped on the shoulder by Resilience New South Wales to say, can you reactivate step by step? So I did pause for a full 30 minutes to really think it through. But I'm happy to say that I feel honoured and grateful to be able to pull together the team again. And this time we're working across quite a large region. So we're actually working across 4 local government areas in New South Wales. So that's my experience. And what I have been really passionate about, and Kris as well, and you'll hear from Kris after me, I've been really passionate about how the involvement of community organisations, and I'll just say at the outset how vital and how incredibly important you are in terms of supporting the recovery of your community. We've both been really passionate that the importance of your role is, number one, recognised and acknowledged, and most importantly, resourced. Because at this point in time, unless you're tapped on the shoulder and provided with specific funding to provide this work, you are already, and you're probably finding that you're going to be doing this work whether you're resourced to do it or not. So Kris and myself do all that we can to advocate to make sure that the work that you do in your community, both pre and post disaster, is made visible to those who make the decisions around recovery. And also at the practice level, Kris and myself are very passionate about supporting you in the work that you do, particularly in the post-disaster world. So I really, really love this graphic. Some of you may have already seen this, but I guess in a way, I think it gives a pretty truthful representation of the long and messy road that is called recovery from disaster. Now, if you ask 20 people who've been through a disaster event what recovery means to them, you will get 20 very different answers. So when I said before, there's no particular really neat end point, you know, from the point of when the disaster hits to the point where people have integrated the experience enough, or they feel like they're on track to a different kind of life. It will look different for everybody. So as you can see from this process, that there are phases that have been conceptualized. And I think we could all probably safely say 5 to 6 months after the events, because as you know, it's been unprecedented and has impacted so much of the country, that I'd say we're in the downward slope, where there is disappointment, anger, frustration, exhaustion. There is also a social component to recovery, which involves what happens in the community in terms of social connection and social networks. I know for the step-by-step team who are out in the field visiting with residents, they are certainly hearing all of the stuff here in the downward slope. They're witnessing it and they're hearing it from residents themselves. The frustration, the anger, the red tape to be able to access, you know, grants. The grants process is unfortunately unnecessarily complex. So this is where people are going to need the support of the supportive helper, which is what your organisations provide, to assist them to navigate the complexity of grants and the recovery system in itself. The social aspects of the impacts of disaster are well documented, and I'm sure we could send you through some presentations and documentation from Dr. Rob Gordon and Dr. David Younger, and they really articulate very well what can happen in a local community post-disaster. What we're already hearing on the ground, the step-by-step team, is it's interesting. We're hearing both communities supporting each other and being really altruistic and self-mobilising to support each other and self-organising to support each other, while at the same time there is fracturing and fragmenting happening in the community. And a lot of that is based on, in some cases, old tensions that have been bubbling away under the surface for some years. Then the disaster comes and it amplifies and turns up the volume on those sorts of tensions. And then in other cases, it can be a sense of inequity or perceived inequity in the distribution of support and disaster assistance. So what we're hearing is, you know, those two baskets, if you like, the basket of community self-mobilising and helping each other, and the basket of the community fracturing and fragmenting. I've shown you this graphic for a reason. And that is that you're going to be there for the long haul. So as I mentioned before, recovery doesn't happen in months or weeks. Recovery is something that is a 3 steps forward, 4 steps back process for most people. And so when all of the large disaster recovery agencies and the assistance programs are completed and finished, because they're not around forever, you will be there and you will continue to be there. The other reason why you and your service is so key is that if we look at the national principles of disaster recovery, and these are the principles in which we as community services and organisations seek to work within this framework, is to understand the context And what that means is that disasters will impact different communities differently based on that community's histories, that community's socioeconomic profile, all of those sorts of elements. And who understands the context of your community better than you? So you already understand the context. You understand the strengths and stresses and the vulnerability points in your community. Recognizing complexity. So the complexity comes from, yep, we've had drought, we've had bushfire, we've had floods, now we've got COVID-19. And not only that, the underlying complexity that already exists within your community. And that complexity might be that we have a high youth unemployment rate, or we have, we just had one of our large manufacturing firms is closed down. So that's had all these ripple effects into the local economy. So nobody understands that complexity better than you, place-based community organisations. Using community-led approaches, you already utilise community-led approaches. You already work within empowerment models and community development models, which are about making sure that the community's voice is part of the process, in every process. And this is even more important post-disaster, because the community's voice often gets lost. And there can often be not just a perception, but a reality of a top-down approach to recovery assistance. Coordinating all activities. So as place-based community organisations, you're already very, very good at coordinating activities and working in partnership with your community service partners, with the local church, with the local RFS, with the local men's shed. You already have those connections in place. Communicating effectively, you know your community really well, and you know the best ways to communicate with them and what's going to resonate with them and what they're going to understand and engage with. Recognising and building capacity. So your services and your staff are all about building capacity. So recognising that pre and post disaster, the community already has pre-existing strengths, pre-existing resource, skills and wisdom. And they need to be fully utilised to support not only individuals, but the whole community to, if you like, go through that period of transformation as they move from their pre-disaster state or pre-disaster way of living in the world to something new and something that is still currently unknown. So you completely and utterly belong in disaster recovery. You're essential. So as I was saying, you play a pivotal role in supporting recovery and resilience. You know and understand your community. You're here for the long haul. Most importantly, you are already the known and trusted faces and places in your community. So it is natural that people will turn to you at their lowest point or at their lowest ebb. And they also need to know that you're going to be there for the long haul, because the recovery space is a very crowded space. So a lot of state and local entities come into your community to provide support. That's all really fantastic. But at some stage of the game, and in many cases, these are new people into the community and new faces, if that makes sense. So it's hard for people to adjust to a new service or a new worker or a new set of services that are going to be delivered when they're still dealing with the trauma of what they've lost, both personally and in their community. Because the losses are both individual in terms of if they've lost their home, but even if they haven't lost their home, their neighbourhood and their street will have been transformed. And in many cases, people will not stay in the area. We're seeing this play out now in the region that we're working in, where people have found out that they're underinsured, they're unable to rebuild in their same street, and it might have been a street they've lived in for 25 years, so now they're going to sell the block and move somewhere else. So neighbours are lost from the street and from the community. not only is the physical landscape transformed and changed, but the social landscape is transformed and changed. So having some continuity there in the community, which is i.e. you and your service, is even more vital. So to do this work, obviously it's going to place demands on your service, and I think you need to prepare that there is going to be increased demand. You probably already have increased demand, but with the complex environment we're working with, I think you can expect that there will be even more demand. So I'm just aware of the time, so I'm just moving on, trying not to speed through too much, but I'm just mindful that I need to leave enough time for questions and things. So one of the big things I'll just, share with you anecdotally, and some of you are probably already hearing this, is COVID-19 has in some ways, if you like, put the brakes on recovery. You might already be hearing this with community members that you're connecting with, because normally what would happen in recovery is you get a lot of volunteer groups going out. Red Cross, for example, would normally go out and do door knocks to check on people's wellbeing and gather data and needs, and then feed them back to the recovery system so that we can plan to deliver the services that are required. Well, obviously COVID has put a huge brake on all of that. And I think that has served to exacerbate people's sense of feeling like they've been forgotten. Also, the consciousness, the collective consciousness of the country, and particularly the media, has moved on into looking at, and understandably, the impacts of COVID-19. So a lot of what the step-by-step team have been hearing is that people have felt like they've been forgotten, and I'm sure many of you are hearing something similar. And so I think being able to provide that personalised, on-the-ground, longer-term connection is really going to help counteract that feeling for people. And often it's really, really the small things and the simple things that can make a difference to people's sense of hope, because the last thing that we need for people is for them to lose hope, that they can actually get through this, that they can reshape and rebuild their lives. I kind of see community organisations and services as hope building factories, if that makes sense. So one of the things that we found was helpful in both experiences, both currently what we're doing and what we did back in 2013 and 14. And I'll contextualise this to talk about the training program that I developed after my first foray into disaster recovery. So one of the things is to, start looking for opportunities to integrate within your existing service delivery some disaster recovery activities. And in saying that, you might be able to look at as both a collective group, as your local interagency, or with some partner services, to look at grant and funding opportunities in which to, if you like, start to plan for some disaster recovery programs and initiatives. But if there's a way that you can think creatively and integrate disaster recovery into existing service delivery in some way, that would be valuable. Most importantly, think and act collectively. Avoid working in silos, because the more faces and people and services that already neurologically and cognitively impacted people have to deal with, the worse it is for them. There's already lots of confusion out there in the community. If they're getting bombarded with too many different services and too many different faces, it just adds to their overwhelm. So coordinate together, think and act collectively. Make sure there is consistency in your messaging. While you can, when you can, get to know your local emergency services. Both people on the ground, develop a relationship with your local RFS captain, and have a look at the systems. Your local council is probably likely to have a local emergency management officer. you know, get to know them. I'll just share something really quickly with you. Back in 2013, step by step, first time around, I was hearing people talking about a lemo. And I honestly thought, isn't a lemur a small furry creature that, you know, runs across the African savannah? No, not a small furry creature, but actually a person who sits in local council, who helps to plan and manage emergencies in the local government area. Try and get familiar with what happens if a disaster is declared in your community. So who are the state players? Who's going to start rolling into your town? And how do I get to talk to them? How do I get to link in with them? Joined up services to address community trauma and social ruptures. So work together, which is what I was saying. And not only that, because your resources are going to be really, really stretched, and they probably already are, work together, share resources, share intel. So what you're hearing on the ground from your community, you know, bring that to the table so you can work collectively on potential solutions and community programs. You will also ensure that everybody's voice in the community is heard. What I'm finding this time around with recovery is that, you know, hopefully this is going to change over time, and I expect it will. But in those early stages, it's very much a command and control framework in terms of making sure everybody's safe, clearing blocks, you know, doing what they need to do to keep people safe. There is really no space there for community input and community decision making, but we are coming into that time now where the community voice is still not being heard. Well, this is in our experience anyway, it might be different where you are. And community service organisations are actually expert at ensuring that the community's voice is being heard. So when we're developing programs and recovery services, those services need to be crafted and designed and guided by the community's voices, their experiences and their choices and preferences. Really key. The other quick thing before I finish, and I'm probably going over time, so Kris will kill me later. When you have time, and this might be, you know, somewhere down the track, but I think it would be really, really helpful if you don't already have access to training and professional development in disaster recovery, that you run your teams through that. Now, Red Cross runs a heck of a lot of fantastic programs that are all completely free and really accessible. So I'd suggest even while you're doing recovery, you tap into those resources. It will help you build your confidence and reassure you that you're doing the right thing. Have opportunities at both your organisational level and at your community interagency level to share experience, practice skills and wisdoms. Share the load where and when you can. So don't work in those silos because you will just get overwhelmed really quickly. You need to share the load, share resources. So one of the things I want to quickly mention before I hand back to our wonderful hosts is after my first step-by-step experience, I came out of it, needed a long holiday, took a deep breath and thought, goodness gracious me, it's got to be easier than that for anyone coming from a community organisation working or find themselves thrust into disaster recovery. So I managed to get some funding from the Office of Emergency Management. I developed an online training program called Walk With, which I developed specifically for you, me, and everybody who's joined us for this webinar, specifically for community organisations, both volunteers, paid staff, managers, and it's all the stuff I wished we had known prior to, you know, entering the disaster recovery field. I'm happy to share details about Walk With. It's a free program for you if you're a not-for-profit. And I'll just put the details up there. So you can see, you can jump onto the Walk With site and you can have a bit of a travel around, and there's a little snapshot video that tells you all about Walk With. If you want to find out a little bit more about step by step, there is also a video about step by step, and that's the YouTube link there that you can see. If you had any more questions about Step by Step or Walk With, that is my email address, stepbystep@gatewayfamilyservices.org.au, and that is also my phone number. But just finishing off, and I know I've gone over, but really I think we need to, as a community services sector, we need to start actually seeing ourselves as being a natural part of the disaster preparedness and recovery system, if you like, because you have the skills, you have the knowledge, you have the connections and the trust of the community. To me, it's a natural fit. We just now need to have a continual recognition of the role of community organisations. We need to prepare ourselves so that we can present and say, hey, we've got all of these knowledge and skills, resource us to do this work. So I'm looking forward to your questions, and thank you so much for your time, and please forgive me for going over time.
Thanks, Anne. It's really great to hear about your experience and the learnings that you're able to share from that experience and bring into the work that you're doing now, as well as sharing it with everyone else that's here. I'll pass over to Kris now. We don't have any questions waiting at the moment, but if people do have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box or in the chat panel. We're keeping an eye on it, and we will be sharing resources and links to presentations and things like that after the webinar. All right, over to you, Kris.
Thanks, Jess. Thanks, Anne. Great segue really into my section of the webinar. So I want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from the traditional country of the Gundungurra and Darug peoples, and pay our respects to elders past, present, and young people emerging as leaders of the future. So I think Anne's given us a really good global picture of how we all got involved in inadvertently in the disaster recovery space, and I think she's made some really good points, critical points, certainly from our Blue Mountains experience of the centrality of community service organisations and local community groups and self-organising groups and volunteers in our local community. We're lucky in the Blue Mountains to have a very well-connected, networked community services more broadly sector. So we've always had good relationships with local health, local education and so on. And following 2013 with some of the other big players like Red Cross and the Salvos and Samidza DePaul and so forth in recovery. So what does community-led recovery look like, and what should your role as a local community sector organisation be in it? And I think the key points here for me are you are local, place-based organisations. As Anne outlined, you are the trusted and known faces on the ground. You have the knowledge of your local community, you have the ear to the ground. It's very difficult for people in, say, a government organisation, whether that's local government, state government, federal government, to get that grassroots intel on the ground from local community members, because they don't know them. I mean, it's not, they don't have those connections, you do. And so that makes community sector organisations and local community groups integral to recovery and as a conduit of information to and from government in recovery. And that's a critical role that no one else can really play. And I think it's something that is a unique selling point, if you like, for community sector organisations, that we do have that role. Part of that role is because building a resilient community is our core business. That's what we as community sector organisations do. That's our job in community. And we do it in different ways. We might be a family support service, and we might be a drug and alcohol service, we might be a mental health support service, disability, aged care, and so on. young people, but we have one thing in common, is that we are coming from the strength-based approach, which is how we've dealt with recovery in the Blue Mountains both times. And I have to say, I agree with Anne. I was kind of hoping I'd get to retire before it happened again on my watch, but I didn't. So there you go. So what does that look like in terms of both recovery and in terms of building a more resilient and prepared community? We decided in 2013-14 that, probably by 2014 in fact, that this is a how long is a piece of string issue. There might be a beginning to recovery, but there's no end to resilience building and preparedness. And so it was critical that as part of the continuum of recovery, we started thinking about how we were going to get better prepared for the next one, because it was becoming obvious with climate change and so forth that there was going to be a next one. It was also very obvious to us that we all got completely caught. We had no idea what to do in recovery. We weren't expecting the numbers that turned up at community sector organisations like neighbourhood centres or family support services or whoever they were. But people came because they trusted us. So how are we going to be, as a sector, better prepared for the next time round? How are we going to better support our workers, our volunteers, our management committees and our managers? How are we going to have a better understanding of what actually happens in the disaster management system more broadly? Because we had no idea. I didn't know what a LEMO was either. I was pretty sure it wasn't a LEMO, but I think that was about as good as I got. I'd never heard of local emergency management committees through local councils or regional ones or state-based ones. We had no idea of the complexity of the system. So one of the things that changed for us was that we were approached by a local, in this case RFS, so Rural Fire Service in New South Wales, mostly volunteer, but these were the community engagement folk, and they came to us and said, look, there's a huge cohort of members of our local community that we've never actually been able to engage with. So elders, people with a disability, young folk, like children and young people, people who perhaps are more vulnerable or more at the fringes of normal society, so to speak. And they said, rather than invest a great deal of time and energy in figuring out how we can connect to these people, we realised that we didn't have to do that because you already are. And essentially they proposed to us a partnership. And that's been an extremely successful ongoing resilience and preparedness group that we have in the Blue Mountains, that every year now, every spring, has an ongoing calendar of events, a Get Ready Blue Mountains program that we have as partnership events between local community services, local community organisations, disaster welfare services, and local emergency management sector, so RFS, SES and so on. And that's been an incredibly successful program because we hold them as place-based events. So in our local village, in our local town, we might have a meet your street barbecue so the neighbours get to know each other. It might be a community morning tea or a family fun day. But all the services are invited and the local community groups are invited. And it's a way of informally connecting with people at the local level. I don't need to tell community service organisations about this. You do this as your core business all the time. It's just a matter of ensuring that what we call the hard hats and the soft hats, so the command and control modality and the recovery and community sector organisation modality get to know each other, get to share their skills and expertise, get to respect each other and rely on each other in both recovery and resilience. So it's the issue of collaboration, I think, for us, and partnership that's been probably the most successful thing. And I have to say that all the work that we've done since 2014 in this space has enabled us to enter the recovery this time round essentially seamlessly, although, as Anne has pointed out, COVID has thrown a huge spanner into the works of the activities that we would be planning. So the face-to-face becomes Facebook or Zoom, or possibly over the fence face-to-face discussions. But we will be expanding our Get Ready program at the end of this year with all of the activities that we had planned in recovery. Push the pause button, and we will be doing those over spring, when hopefully A, be warmer in the Blue Mountains, but also B, hopefully the COVID restrictions will be raised to some extent. I think that's all I want to say at the moment. But I'm looking forward to getting some questions and having a bit of discussion around the group. So,
great, thanks, Kris. We've got a question here asking around, have you experienced any issues with providing a consistent message? So each organisation has a slightly different approach to emergency management. So how did you find that in the work that you were doing?
okay, yeah, so that was actually really critical as part of the partnership or collaboration that we did. So the Disaster Welfare Services, Red Cross, Salvos, etc. in New South Wales, the local representatives of those who were all still operating in the recovery space, joined with the local community sector organisations to decide on what our key messages actually were. So that was a really important initiative, I think, because that consistency of messaging is really important, especially in recovery. If any of you've been through recovery processes, you know that the brain fog that affects people in shock who are emerging from a disaster requires you to keep repeating the same message over and over again, often for 12, 18 months more at a time, until people are ready to hear it. And they will be shocked that you've told them this information, even though they've heard it before, because it simply didn't register the first time round. So short, concise, steadily repeated messages in every modality you can think of. So whether that's a banner on the bridge over the highway, whether that's a printed flyer that appears in their mailboxes, whether it's something posted up at the local supermarket or newsagents or pharmacy or wherever, whether that's call flute messaging at the local neighbourhood centre or family support service, it doesn't really matter. Emails, messages given by the recovery support service and by the Red Cross outreach workers, whoever it is, you need to have that consistent messaging. That's absolutely critical. Thanks for that question. Good question.
Can I also mention that please keep the messaging jargon free. I think that one of the things we step by step were really, start my video. Sorry about that. There's some consistent messaging there. Start your video, Anne. I think keeping it jargon free, keep the messages positive without being Pollyanna-ish, because I think one of the things that people need to know, number one, is that they haven't been forgotten. So what we've done in our region, so we're covering 4 LGAs, as I mentioned before, we've been meeting with each of the councils And each of the councils are trying to come up with that consistent messaging that Kris was talking about. What we're hearing from residents on the ground, this is the step-by-step team are now going out and conducting outreach visits, you know, cuppers over the fence, as we call it. And what we're hearing is that people are getting information, but as Kris said, their capacity to engage in that information is compromised. So hence the need to simplify the messaging, repeat the same messaging over a long period of time so that you actually capture people as they move out of survival brain back into prefrontal cortex, you know, higher order thinking, if that makes sense. But please keep the jargon out. Don't throw in terms like PTSD, because then everybody runs around thinking like, I've got PTSD. Where in actual fact, we really also need to normalise. And one of the things we're looking at messaging at the moment, right, Kris, is to let people know this is how you might be feeling at the moment, and that's normal. So a little bit of education. So a lot of people will go through the experience in isolation and think, oh my God, I must have PTSD. Whereas we know about 10% of the population, 10 to 20% of the population post-disaster may or have a diagnosis of PTSD, but they might have already had pre-existing some vulnerabilities, health vulnerabilities. So jargon-free, keep it positive and hopeful. And if you can work that out as a sector, that would be wonderful.
I'm on mute.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of questions that have come up. So one from Cheryl is around, as a community group, how can we best connect with our communities during COVID? So what are some of the ways, Anne and Kris, you've been able to connect with community as a result while we've been experiencing COVID?
Go, Anne.
Okay. Yes, that threw a huge spanner because Step by Step is actually designed to be a mobile outreach service. So of course, we only just started and then we had to kind of backtrack. So what we did was a lot of email blasts, which is we were able to get resident data with addresses and things like that. So we just conducted a whole lot of email blasts and postal mail. We used snail mail. Some people obviously didn't have post boxes left after the fires, so we had to do a lot of detective work to try to work out the best ways to connect with them. And that purpose of that was to introduce Step by Step. So I thought rather than just pick up the phone and do some cold calls at a time when people are going, who are you, where are you from? So we just did the email blast. We also did organised to have some media releases through local council on the 4 local council websites, you know, pictures with the mayor, all that sort of stuff, on local radio as well. So just to let people know this is Step by Step and this is who we are. And then we followed up with phone calls. And so we've been, and then obviously people had the technology. It was doing Zoom connections and meetings. As soon as the Premier in New South Wales said 2 adults can go and visit 1 adult in their household, we were out on the road. And so it is now a mix where it includes actual physical outreach visits, as I mentioned, having a cuppa over the fence with all the physical distancing that's required. So each of the Step by Step team members had their own COVID kit in the car. So they got masks, wipes, gloves, and the hand rubs, etc., and they keep that 1.5 metre distancing. We have found that the outreach visits have been a huge relief to the residents. As I mentioned before, email and phone is fine, and that works really well for some residents. But for others, particularly the more vulnerable and those who've been particularly impacted by COVID and the isolation that has brought for them, or the isolation it has exacerbated. To be honest, we've had people crying. They were just so relieved. They were just shedding tears and just feeling like Oh, you mean so you can stay and have a cuppa, and so you mean you can come back? So that's how we've been dealing with it for now.
And back in 2013, the Health and Wellbeing Group relied a lot on the Red Cross outreach visits. So they were an additional source of intel for us about what was going on, because we saw our role as identifying what the themes were that at a strategic level that we could deal with across the impacted communities. And in addition to that, as we got used to getting the feedback from the outreach officers, what helped was being able to ask them to ask additional questions. So there are some, how you doing kind of questions that are part of the normal pack that the Red Cross volunteers will ask. But in addition to that, we would say, okay, we're getting some hints that such and such might be an issue. Are you okay about adding that to your list of questions to ask and bringing back the results to us, which helped to direct our long-term recovery work, which was really helpful. But Step by Step now has a regular newsletter, and we're just waiting on the local council folk to agree on what they think the key messages are for us to start using that in terms of some of the advertising I was talking about before. So banners on the bridges over the highway, places where people are going to see it in their local community. In the very top upper mountains, they're quite isolated communities and very large semi-rural blocks, so they're physically separated from each other anyway. So there's a proposal to do a kind of street library kind of concept. So there's no local notice board in the local shopping centre, because there isn't a local shopping centre, it's that isolated. So to be able to leave brochures, to be able to leave the step-by-step newsletter there on a regular basis so that locals can get that information as they happen to be passing by a central spot. So hopefully we've got some men shed making us up some of those little street library type receptacles for some of our messaging. It is difficult because some people, quite a few people in the affected upper mountains villages, the mounts in particular, have very poor telecoms, even at the best of times before the blue cable got burnt out by the fires, and poor mobile reception as well. So that's made it very difficult. Our little group got a bit of the money from the council, got some monies from the federal government as part of the recovery. They've allocated some of that to our wellbeing group to be able to disperse on worthwhile projects, and many of the projects that it was intended for can't go ahead because of COVID. So one of the little applications that we put in was to get some iPads for Step by Step to be able to use in two-way FaceTime or Zoom conversations with people who might not be able to come out during COVID. So,
somebody just asked me a question about the cuppas over the fence. Yes, each of the steppers have a kit, and what they take out is tea, coffee, yummy biscuits or homemade scones, thermos of hot water. We also got a donation of beautiful hand knitted and crocheted blankets from Wrap with Love in Orange, which is in the central west of New South Wales. And we already take some blankets out, and people are absolutely loving them. So they wrap themselves up, they have a cuppa, they have a chat on the front veranda or over the fence, and they're really loving that kind of connection.
We've got so many questions. Thank you for your level of engagement. It's amazing to see. I think one of the ones that I thought would be great is we've got a question here from Helen talking about obvious aspects of disaster resilience and ongoing care, and how there are those non-practical sort of questions that sometimes people want to ask, maybe around their spiritual aspects of life. And so how important do you think it is for people to be able to simply ask those questions, which often don't actually have an answer, and have somebody who's simply able to just sit and listen with them?
Absolutely. Anne?
Yeah, look, when I brought on the new step-by-step team, one of the things I was looking at is people's capacity to sit with uncertainty. Because as you all know, with recovery, it's unpredictable. Everything is uncertain. There are so many things out of people's control. And earlier in my PowerPoint, you might have, I talked about the transformative aspects of disaster recovery. And it's one of the things I'm particularly interested in, because one of the things you'll probably hear eventually, and we certainly heard this back in 2013 with some people that we walked alongside for a longer period of time, was there's existential aspects of disaster. So it had many people questioning their pathway in life, in other words. What is the meaning? What is the meaning of, I spent, for example, 40 years building this home, building this life, and the fires came through and they took everything in a matter of 10 minutes. And so once people were sort of past the basic survival, it's almost, like the Maslow hierarchy of needs, if you like, and they had space to actually start to reflect on their experience, a lot of bigger life questions were coming up for them. And certainly I know the step-by-step team would just spend that time sitting with people. And actually the team got so much from that, really, hearing how people make sense of a senseless experience, how they integrate traumatic experience and transforming it into something different. On a practical level, we heard quite a few cases where people just left their marriage of 40 years, for example, or decided, I've been unhappy in this job for 10 years. Why am I persisting? Life is precious, it's fragile. So there are very much those transformative aspects of disaster, both positive and negative.
And in the resilience building space, those can often be protective factors. So faith is recognised, spiritual practice is recognised. But some of the things that we used, particularly in recovery, were creative arts. So the Blue Mountains has a very strong creatives base anyway. We used physical activity, but we used things like yoga and mindfulness and those sorts of things as well. So they're important protective factors to be building into not just recovery from now, but for the future. And the, recovery is a marathon, not a sprint, is a really important message to give to community, but that there are protective factors. But probably the biggest protective factor, which I didn't mention earlier, is connections. We know from our own experience and from all the national and international research that it's the number of connections, good quality connections that you have with family, friends and neighbours and community that is the most significant protective factor against, future shocks. So the basis of all of the work we do, whether it's recovery, so the strength-based, the agency of the individual or the family and that's where, again, community-led recovery comes in, because it's individuals, it's family units, it's villages or townships and neighbours, but it's also the community as a whole needs to have agency in all of this. And if they don't have agency, if someone else is doing recovery at them, those stages of disillusionment and community fracturing and anger and resentment will just go on, possibly, definitely.
Sorry, Jess, can I just mention one more thing in relation to that? Kris is absolutely right. All of the research, both locally and internationally, speaks of the importance of connected relationships in terms of, for want of a better word, healing from the trauma of disaster. Can I also mention that the natural environment for many people plays a significant role in terms of their own spirituality. And so obviously, if people are able to access, places of natural beauty, and I think with COVID starting to lift in national parks or those kinds of parklands and things, reopening to the community, I think, is really, really imperative in terms of people's spiritual healing, if you like, because so many people do get that sort of sustenance from the natural environment. I know it's been extremely distressing for many people to have so much of that natural environment, including animals and birds. Many people are very connected with the flora and fauna of their surrounding environment. When they've seen so much destruction, I think that's been, you know, particularly a particularly hard impact.
That's actually just leading on from that comment, and Red Cross were approached by a wildlife caring organisation to actually run sessions for wildlife carers, and we're doing that next week. So a similar sort of webinar style with 2 green threads and a psychologist that we work with called Lynn Page, so specifically for wildlife carers, because we recognise that not only were they impacted by the bushfires, but also in the area of work that they particularly care about. I did want to recognise one of the comments that was made here, which was a bit of a question, which was about a lot of the vitriol and the media that Red Cross and other organisations have received recently. And I appreciate Jo's comment that it misses the point that recovery is about length of time. You know, it's long term at both the individuals and communities. I will say that some of my staff and colleagues have received comments, not just in bushfire impacted areas, but where we provide support to our staff to be able to debrief about those sorts of events. Quite often, if there is somebody who was impacted by the bushfires, as in they lost their homes, that's a very narrow definition of impact. It's a matter of actually going and talking to them. There are understandably some misconceptions around whether or not Red Cross had a list of people who lost their homes, which we don't, which is why we continue to put out information about the grants, because the only way people can access them is if we get told who they are or if they come to us. And so that's why we keep promoting that. And understanding around the timeframes of when our grants actually started, which was only in early January, even though there were bushfires impacting communities across the state, including in Queensland, and then into Victoria and South Australia since June last year. But I appreciate the recognition of that, the impact that those sorts of comments have. There are a couple of other questions. There's so many. I'm really impressed with how engaged everyone is and such fantastic questions. So there's a question here from Jackie, who's interested in how recovery actions and functions have become part of normal business for organisations. So it's currently seen as episodic or different. Or
an add-on.
Yeah, exactly. And is often unfunded. So this is, so it would be great if you could talk a little bit about how you have, I guess, perhaps encompassed the idea of recovery actions and functions into the work that you do more broadly, Kris and Anne.
So from my organisation's point of view, we're the local peak body for the community sector, so we don't normally do direct service delivery to the public. But in general, I can say of our member organisations that post-2013, our collective efforts have, I think, led to a change of attitude and behaviours. Sadly, in New South Wales, the wherewithal, i.e. resources, and Anne alluded to this in her introductory comments, is missing. There are grants for innovative projects, which are fantastic, I have to say, the CRIP grants, but there is no ongoing funding for community sector organisations. Indeed, there's never been, until possibly lately, the capacity for an organisation to recoup out-of-pocket expenses. So we found back in 2013 that several of the neighbourhood centres who were involved, for example, their meeting room turned into, I think there was 12 people in there for 12 months, hot desking, step by step was there for a while. And what that meant was that their normal business as usual activities, that they might have a peer support group or the local choir, or it might be a regular meeting or something like that, the craft group, the clack and yak group, had to be held somewhere else, and they had to pay for that venue elsewhere. So really simple things like that. Pods. So they hired pods because the influx of physical donations was so enormous, uncalled for and often not really useful, but they needed to find some way of dealing with that, so they had to hire the pods. So those organisations which were stretched back in 2013 are, to be honest, much more stretched even now. Back at end of 2019, with rising homelessness, and now following Black Summer and COVID, the call on services for domestic violence, support for mental health support, for just general recovery support has gone up. And so there's a gap in the system, in my view, in New South Wales. Certainly Anne and I keep advocating about this on an ongoing basis, that the national mantra of shared responsibility is terrific, and we absolutely agree with that, that community service organisations and community groups need to be an integral part of both recovery and preparedness and resilience. But in order to do that, on top of our day job, so to speak, there needs to be resourcing to allow us to do that. It's a gap. I know other states have different arrangements, but it's certainly an issue for us. And
I totally agree with Kris. At the moment, it's rhetoric. There isn't actually resourcing and recognition of the increased demand that you're dealing with. So there's a lot of sort of grants and money, and understandably and absolutely needed for those directly impacted, but we've yet to see any additional dollars. I mean, Step by Step is funded by Resilience New South Wales, which is fantastic. So there are parts of government that recognise the role of community organisations, but I think the next step is to actually bring resources into the community sector, not just for not just for one team, if that makes sense. So I think the first thing that Gateway Family Services did after Step by Step 2013 is develop, and I would suggest you all do this, is develop our own disaster resilience plan. And so when you have time and a moment to breathe, there's some great resources, MCRN pulled together a planning template for community organisations to start, because your community will be impacted in lots of different ways. So for example, what does your community do if you have to close your doors because your venues are flooded? Or, what do you do if your staff can't get into work because the roads are blocked, for example? So there's all those really kind of nut and bolt things that you need to be looking at as an organisation in terms of, so that you can keep functioning for the community. So that's the first thing we did. That was to develop our own disaster resilience plan.
And longer term, I think it's really important to start making those connections with your local emergency management processes, your local SES and RFS people on the ground, the LEMO. If you don't know what a LEMO is, go find them. You're probably attached to your local council, to start introducing yourself to them, because to be honest, you need long-term trusting relationships, and the middle of an emergency is probably not the best time to start developing those. So find out who they are, see if you can get invited to the local emergency management committee meetings, even if it's only to make a presentation to them about what's happening in recovery in your community at the moment, where the needs are, where the gaps are, where resources are required, because you're doing this basically on the smell of an oily rag to start with. So in terms of longer term planning for preparedness and recovery, though, I have to say that our involvement with the local emergency management committee has just been amazing, and kudos to our local OEM team, so what's now Resilience New South Wales, and their recovery team for recognising that something needed to change in our state anyway, for our jurisdiction, in terms of how engaged the emergency management system wasn't with community sector organisations and vice versa, and starting to look at things like a community resilience network for both economic recovery and for community recovery. And I have to say that was a really great basis, having had those community meetings with everybody who was interested in recovery and building more preparedness and resilience, to be able to contact all of those people and invite them to the health and wellbeing group for 2020. It made a wonderful base to leap from.
Absolutely, Kris. And I think what Kris is really highlighting is a culture shift on both ends, from the soft hat and the hard hat side of things. So the culture shift is, as community organisations, we actually had to stake our claim in the recovery space and say, we've got all of these skills, this is what we do, we're all about community, and there's had to be a culture shift and recognition from the hard hat aspects to recognise that, hey, yep, these guys have got a lot to offer. It's not our area of expertise, so, you know, working together as, and I'll use your term, Kris, a marriage made in heaven, if you can get those aspects together. But we first have to recognise and not be passive and go, they're the experts, leave them to it. We actually have to recognise our own skills and our expertise and what we have to offer, and to stake our claim, to claim our position as an integral part of the disaster recovery and preparedness program for your state.
Thank you both. There's a couple of questions here. I know I can see that we're quickly running out of time. I thought there was a great question about what support do you have for staff who provide these vital but sometimes challenging services. I'll let you talk. I'm happy to also talk about, from a Red Cross perspective, what we do as well, but I'll let you go first.
Well, if I just talk from the step-by-step team point of view, look, there's so many different ways of coming at it. I think you're absolutely right. The risk for vicarious trauma is high if you're doing this kind of work, because obviously in the terminology, you're exposed to a lot of traumatic material. So if you're going out and driving to people's places, you're not only hearing their stories, and, you know, be prepared, and you're probably already hearing this. I know the steppers, as I affectionately call them, the steppers go out, and in many cases, the first thing people will say to them is, I've lost everything. And then they will proceed to need to talk about what happened on that day, or how they just escaped with flames licking at their heels, or they watched their animals burn, or, you know, so they're exposed to a lot of traumatic material and over a long period of time. So one of the things that we obviously put in place straight away is clinical supervision. So it's not just about supervision about their practice, because the practice and the practice model we operate from is integral to how effective we are in this space, but also to check on their well-being. Simple things like, as their manager, I'll check to see where their leave is at. So I just really like to make sure that people get that opportunity to step away completely, you know, I encourage them to not watch the news, to, you know, go to the beach for a few days or whatever it might be, do something fun, take their minds off it. We also had team days, which is just getting together to watch a funny movie and watch popcorn, for example, and have a bit of a laugh. But obviously also having the EAT program, the Employee Assistance Program, it might be different in different states, but they are also able to confidentially access counsellors that are provided through Gateway Family Services. So we talk a lot about self-care. So we integrate that as part of all of our conversations and all of our team meetings. So what are you doing to look after yourself this week? They have opportunities to debrief every single week. So I think it's all those little things that you pull together to, you know, make it explicit that this is a risk. It could very well happen to you, and this is what we need to put in place to try and prevent it.
And our experience in 2013 taught us a lot, primarily that we didn't do anything explicit to support the supporters, and we needed to. So we've learned from our experience. It was a big task back in 2013, and we kind of got overwhelmed, and wasn't something that we thought of until the amazing Jolie Wills from Red Cross Christchurch came and gave a presentation about their supporting the supporters package, which was fantastic, and I can strongly recommend that. And I know Red Cross also has the self-care and recovery basics, and some of those other communicating in recovery, some of those other really good baseline free training for anybody in the sector. The other thing I would suggest is that Anne mentioned earlier, we did some work in 2014 and beyond about getting our sector better prepared. So part of the issue there is that workers can have confidence that if, for example, the road gets blocked by fire or flood or whatever it might be, and they can't get to work, that their workplace has an arrangement with somewhere that's closer to where they actually live, so that they might be able to hot desk from there or swap resources between different sectors. In other words, that there's a plan, that their sector, their organisation, has a plan for what the workers are going to do, for what the organisation's going to do. I think everyone's probably just adding a pandemic/epidemic policy to all this arrangement. But it's the little things. You know, at a personal level, I remember someone gave me a hug and said, "Oh, you poor thing, that must have been awful," after a particularly nasty meeting. And I just burst into tears, because it was the first time anyone had, you know, except within our wellbeing group, had actually recognised that we were all struggling a bit with a new system. I remember Step by Step back then had a little bit of money left at the end of their tenure, and they gave all of the wellbeing people a free massage if they wanted one, which was lovely. But it's those little things, looking after your staff and volunteers, a box of chocolates, a bunch of flowers, a birthday card, you know, a massage, something simple that doesn't have to be, you know, expensive or extreme. You know, you don't have to have the mega banquet thank you dinner. It can be something simple. It's probably better to be something simple in little sequins through life, rather than one big, you know, thank you event by council at the end.
Just before you talk about what Red Cross offers, just very quickly, I wanted to mention that despite the challenges of the work, all of the step-by-step team found the work incredibly rewarding. And they were actually extremely grateful to have had the opportunity to connect with these residents, because yes, they were hearing traumatic stories, but they were also hearing about how incredibly resilient and resourceful and clever people are. So the rewards of the work in many ways can also sort of balance up the challenges.
Great, thanks, Anne. So I think Kris and Anne have highlighted a lot of the same sorts of things that Red Cross do. We have an employee assistance program, so our staff are able to access that. We also, because of the sheer scale of these fires and the locations where we have staff, one, it's been very hard for them to even, especially with COVID, actually meet face to face. So we've buddied people up, and we've tried to buddy people up with other recovery officers that are not in the same state as them, so that they're able to share information, but have that person who's outside of their immediate work sphere to download with. And the staff I'm their manager, and I make myself available to my staff. And as we continue on, as Jamie mentioned right at the start, Red Cross is committed to a 3-year recovery program. So we continue to provide those supports, whether that's sessions with psychologists through APS, or other ways in which we can actually support that ongoing mental health of our own staff. And we actually run the recovery basics and self-care training that was mentioned in the chat. We run that for all of our staff when they start. So just to give them a bit of an overview even of this recovery space, because it's not an area that people actually have a background in working in most of the time. There are not many people who have, there are thankfully not that many people who've actually had to work in this sector before, but it does make it quite a challenge when people do find themselves working in it, because it's a really challenging work, but as Anne said, it is really rewarding. I'm very conscious of time, so I'm going to pass back to Jamie, who will wrap us up. And I'm aware that we haven't answered all of your questions, so we will try and send information in a follow-up email afterwards to try and address some of those as well.
Yes, thanks heaps, Jessie, and thank you all so much again for joining us for today's webinar. We really hope you have enjoyed the session. A special thanks to our guests, of course, Kris and Anne, and a huge thank you to Jessie for facilitating our webinar today. Just a reminder that this webinar was recorded, and we will send you a link to the recording, all of the resources mentioned in today's session, as well as a survey seeking feedback to help us improve our content and delivery. Now, if you are on LinkedIn, I would encourage you to join us at the Disaster Recovery Practitioners Australia group to continue the conversation. Again, we'll email out the link to that for you to join us. Now, the purpose of that group is to share information about the practice of disaster recovery for community members, local government, local organisations, schools, businesses, amongst others. There are many people who are going to face being a recovery manager for the first time, even if disaster recovery is nowhere near their job title. The Australian Red Cross also runs the Disaster Recovery Mentors Australia program, which is aimed at supporting communities impacted by disaster to drive their own recovery. Now, what we do is actually link volunteer mentors like our wonderful Kris Newton, who have previous personal experience in disaster recovery with community members and leaders. Again, you may be a recovery officer, school principal, involved in the local council or a community service organisation, and you're currently in the midst of recovery, and the idea is to discuss and address challenges posed by the whole disaster recovery process. So again, the mentoring aims to help community leaders avoid the unnecessary pitfalls of recovery, help normalise the recovery experience, and equally share their experience, provide support, and act as a bit of a sounding board. Now, if you're interested in further information about the DRMA program, the Disaster Recovery Mentors Australia program, please email us at recovery@redcross.org.au. This was one of a series of webinars supporting the sector, so please keep an eye out on the Red Cross website for upcoming webinars. Thank you again for joining us. Until next webinar, goodbye.